My name is Naomi Calder, and I found out my marriage was over on a Tuesday afternoon while I was sitting in my car outside a concrete supplier, waiting for a delivery slip to print. I want to start there because I think people expect these stories to begin with a scream, with a slammed door, with a dish shattering against a wall. Mine did not begin that way. It began with the quiet buzz of a phone I was not even trying to look at, a phone that lit up on the passenger seat because Derek had left his tablet logged into our shared photo backup and a message thread synced across without either of us meaning it to. I was not snooping. I want to be honest about that, because honesty is the only thing I have left that nobody can take from me, and I intend to hold on to it carefully. I glanced down because the screen lit up twice in a row, the way it does when someone is typing quickly, and I saw a name I did not recognize attached to a string of messages that told me everything I needed to know in about 4 seconds. Bree. I want to tell it slow, because I lived it slow, minute by minute, and I think the slowness is part of what makes it real. The first thing I felt was not rage. I want to be precise about that because for a long time I thought something was wrong with me for not feeling rage first. What I felt was a kind of falling sensation, like the moment an elevator drops half a foot before the cable catches, that lurch in your stomach where your body understands something before your mind has caught up and agreed to believe it. I am an engineer. I inspect buildings for a living. I look at load calculations and stress points and I tell people whether the thing they built is going to hold. And in that moment, sitting in my car with a delivery slip printing 3 feet away, I understood with total clarity that the structure I had spent 9 years living inside had already failed, and I was only now being shown the crack. I did not cry in the parking lot. I want to say that plainly because I think there is a version of this story people expect, where the woman falls apart the second she finds out, and I did not do that, not because I am made of something harder than other people, but because I have spent my whole career training myself to look at a catastrophic problem and ask what happens next instead of asking why did this happen to me. Why did this happen to me is a question that keeps you standing in the wreckage. What happens next is the question that gets you out of it. I read through 11 months of messages in that parking lot with the engine running and the air conditioning blowing cold air across a face that refused to do anything except sit very still. And by the time the delivery man tapped on my window to hand me a clipboard, I had already made the first decision of the rest of my life. I signed for the concrete. I said thank you. I drove to my next site visit and I did my job, because the beam I was inspecting that afternoon did not care that my marriage was over, and neither, it turned out, did anyone else in my family, once they found out. Let me back up, because I think you need to understand who I was before that Tuesday, so you understand what it actually cost me to become who I am now. I married Derek Calder when I was 26 years old, in a backyard in late September, under string lights his mother had insisted on hanging herself because she did not trust the rental company to get the spacing right. Derek was charming in a way that felt effortless rather than practiced, at least at first. He worked for his family's business, Calder and Sons, a mid-sized construction company that had built half the strip malls and a good portion of the modest apartment complexes in our part of the state. I was 2 years out of my engineering degree, working my way toward my professional license, doing structural inspection work for a consultancy that occasionally contracted with companies like his. That is, in fact, how we met. I flagged a rebar spacing issue on a foundation his crew had poured, and instead of being defensive about it the way most site managers were, he asked me to explain exactly what I was seeing and why it mattered. I liked that about him. I liked that he could sit with being wrong instead of arguing his way out of it. I did not yet know that this quality, the quality that made me fall for him, would quietly disappear somewhere around year 4 of our marriage, replaced by a man who had learned that his last name opened doors that made arguing unnecessary. My family loved him immediately, and I want to be honest about why, because the why matters more than almost anything else in this story. My father, Frank Whitfield, ran a small landscaping business, the kind of operation with 3 trucks and a rotating crew of 6 or 7 guys depending on the season. For years, the steadiest work he had, the contracts that let him make payroll in the slow months, came through subcontracts with Calder and Sons. When I married into that family, my father did not just gain a son-in-law. He gained security. My mother, Linda, understood this in the way mothers understand things they never say out loud, and my brother Scott, who did electrical work and picked up jobs wherever he could find them, understood it too, because more than a few of his jobs over the years had come from the same source. I did not think about any of this on my wedding day. I was 26 and in love, and I thought the string lights were beautiful. It took me years to understand that my marriage had, without anyone ever saying so directly, become the load-bearing wall for my entire family's financial peace of mind, and that nobody in that family was going to let it come down without a fight, even if the fight was against me. The 11 months of messages I read in that parking lot told a story that was, in its own way, almost mundane. Derek had met Bree Ashford at a marketing conference the company sent him to, and what started as flirtation over shared hotel bar drinks had turned into something that had clearly become important to him in a way our marriage had stopped being. I read the way he talked to her, easy and warm and interested, and I recognized it, because it was the way he used to talk to me, back when I was still new enough to be interesting rather than familiar. There is a particular kind of grief in realizing that the best version of someone is still available, just not to you anymore. I sat with that grief for exactly the length of time it took to read the messages once, and then I closed the app, and I did not open it again that day. I did not confront him that night. I want to explain why, because I think it is the most important decision in this entire story, more important even than anything that came after. If I had walked in the door and thrown the phone at him and screamed, I would have handed him something. I would have handed him the chance to be sorry in the moment, to cry, to promise, to turn my discovery into a crisis he got to manage and apologize his way through, the way he had learned to manage every other problem in his life, by being charming until the discomfort passed. I did not want to give him that. I also did not, if I am telling the whole truth, trust myself yet to know what I wanted to do with what I knew. So instead, I made dinner. I sat across from him at our kitchen table while he talked about a supplier issue on a job site, and I nodded, and I asked normal questions, and I watched him with the same clinical attention I give a crack in a foundation wall, trying to determine whether it is cosmetic or structural, whether it is something you patch or something that tells you the whole building is compromised. By the time I did the dishes that night, I already knew the answer. It was structural. The whole thing was compromised, and had probably been compromised for longer than 11 months, if I was being honest with myself about all the small ways he had been absent long before Bree ever had a name. There was something else, though, something I had not told Derek, something I had not told anyone, and it is the reason this story does not end where you might expect it to. 6 months before I found those messages, in my work as the outside reviewing engineer on an affordable housing project Calder and Sons had won the contract for, I found something that troubled me far more than any affair could. The soil compaction reports and the structural inspection documents submitted for the foundation work on that project did not match the data I had personally collected during my site visits. Someone had altered the numbers to make substandard work look compliant, work that was going to house families who would have no idea that the ground beneath their apartment building had been signed off on with falsified paperwork. I did not know yet, in that moment, exactly who had done it or why, but I knew Calder and Sons had submitted it, and I knew that if I raised the alarm immediately and clumsily, the company my father depended on, the company that employed my husband, would come down on top of me before I understood the full shape of what I was looking at. So I did what I do. I documented. Quietly, carefully, without telling a single person, I began pulling my own inspection records, cross-referencing dates, requesting copies of reports through channels that would not raise flags, building a file that existed nowhere except on an external drive I kept in a lockbox at my own office, not our house. I also began, in those same quiet months, finishing the paperwork for my own independent engineering license, something I had been slow walking for 2 years because Derek had always found small reasons it wasn't the right time, reasons that in hindsight were never really about timing at all. I started making calls about state inspection contracts that would let me work entirely outside Calder and Sons, outside my father's dependency on them, outside the entire tangled financial ecosystem my marriage had accidentally become the center of. I did not know, when I started that work, that I would need it as badly as I eventually did. I told myself I was just being prudent, that any professional should have options, that it never hurts to diversify your client base. I understand now that some part of me had already sensed the crack forming, long before I found the messages that made it impossible to ignore. The day after I read those texts, I called a lawyer, a woman named Patricia Ostrander who a colleague had recommended years earlier for an unrelated matter, and I asked for a consultation, not because I had decided anything yet, but because I wanted to understand my own position before I did anything that could not be undone. I did not tell my parents. I did not tell Scott. I certainly did not tell Derek that I knew. I went to work that week and I inspected 2 commercial sites and I signed off on one and flagged the other for corrections, and nobody who watched me do my job would have known that my personal life had quietly detonated 4 days earlier. People sometimes ask me how I managed to function, and the honest answer is that function was the only thing I trusted myself to do. Feelings, I could sit with later. Function, I understood in my bones. It took Derek 9 more days to find out that I knew, and he did not find out from me. He found out because Bree, in a moment of carelessness or perhaps guilt, sent a message to the wrong thread, a message that landed not on his phone but on the shared family calendar app his mother had insisted the whole family use, the same app one still had access to because nobody had ever thought to remove me. His mother saw it before I did. Within an hour, my mother-in-law called my own mother, and within 2 hours, my mother called me, not to ask if I was all right, not first, but to ask, with an edge of panic in her voice I had never heard before, what I was planning to do about it. I remember standing in my kitchen holding that phone, looking out the window at the small garden bed Derek had never once helped me weed in 9 years of marriage, and understanding, with the same clean clarity I had felt in the parking lot, that my mother was not calling because her daughter's heart was broken. She was calling because she was afraid of what a broken marriage would mean for my father's contracts, for the version of stability our whole family had quietly built on top of my relationship without ever asking whether I could bear the weight of it forever. I told her I did not know yet what I was going to do. That was true. What I did not tell her, what I did not tell anyone, was that I already had a file with 11 months of evidence in one drawer of my mind and 6 months of falsified structural reports in another, and that whatever I decided to do, I intended to decide it on my own terms, in my own time, without absorbing 1 more ounce of panic that was never mine to carry in the first place. That night, after I hung up the phone, I sat at my kitchen table alone, because Derek had not yet come home, and I made a list. I am an engineer. Making lists is how I process the world. On one side, I wrote down everything I stood to lose. My marriage. The house, possibly. The comfortable fiction that my family loved me unconditionally, a fiction that was already showing its first genuine crack. On the other side, I wrote down everything I still had, everything that belonged entirely to me and could not be taken in a divorce or revoked by a disappointed mother. My license, nearly finished. My own client relationships, built over years on the strength of my own work. A file, growing heavier by the week, that documented exactly what Calder and Sons had done to cut corners on a project meant to house people who trusted that the walls around them had been properly inspected. And underneath all of it, something I had not let myself feel yet, something that did not look like grief at all when I finally let it surface. It looked like relief. It looked like the particular, quiet relief of finally being allowed to stop holding up a structure that had been failing for years, and start building something of my own instead. I did not confront Derek that night either. I let him come home, tired from a site visit, oblivious to the fact that his mother already knew, and I watched him eat dinner across from me one more time without saying a word about what I knew, because I was not ready yet, and because for the first time in longer than I could remember, I was making a decision based entirely on what I needed, and not on what would keep everyone else comfortable. That, more than anything, was the moment my marriage actually ended. Not when I read the messages. Not when my mother called in a panic that had nothing to do with my heart. It ended the moment I chose, quietly and without permission from anyone, to stop performing the version of Naomi who absorbed everyone else's crises and started becoming the version of Naomi who was about to make sure that the next time this family gathered to discuss what should happen to her, she would already have built something they had no idea existed, and no way left to touch. My mother called again the morning after I made my list, and this time she did not lead with panic. She led with strategy, though she would never have called it that, because in her mind she was still being a mother, still trying to hold her family together the only way she knew how. She asked me whether I had spoken to Derek yet. She asked me whether I had considered that people make mistakes, that men strayed sometimes and it did not always mean the marriage was over, that her own mother had stayed with a man who wandered twice and had a good 30 years afterward to show for it. I let her talk. I have learned that letting people talk is often the fastest way to understand exactly what they are afraid of, and what my mother was afraid of had very little to do with my happiness and everything to do with the quiet architecture of dependency our family had built without ever naming it out loud. I did not tell her about the messages I had already read in detail. I did not tell her about the file growing on my external drive. I told her only that I needed time to think, and she made a sound on the other end of the phone that was somewhere between a sigh and a warning, the sound of a woman recalculating her odds. I hung up the phone and I went to work, because work was still the one place where the ground under my feet had not shifted, where a beam either held its load or it did not, where the truth of a structure could not be talked around or managed with charm. Derek found out that I knew 4 days later, on a Thursday evening, and it did not happen the way I expected. I had planned, in the quiet architecture of my own mind, to choose the moment myself, to sit him down when I was ready with the calm and control I had been rehearsing since that afternoon in the parking lot. But control is a strange thing to hold on to when you are married to someone who has spent his whole life assuming problems resolve themselves in his favor if he simply waits them out. He came home that Thursday with a stiffness in his shoulders I recognized immediately, the posture of a man who has been told something is coming and has spent the drive home rehearsing his own defense. His mother had finally told him what she knew. He did not deny it when I asked. I will give him that much. He sat down across from me at the same kitchen table where I had eaten dinner across from him in silence 9 days earlier, and he said her name out loud for the first time, Bree, and something in the saying of it, the ease with which it left his mouth, told me more than the 11 months of messages ever had. He did not apologize the way I might have imagined, in some earlier version of my life, a man apologizing to his wife might sound. He explained. He told me about feeling unseen, about feeling like our marriage had become 2 people managing a household rather than 2 people who chose each other, and some small honest part of me, even in that moment, recognized truth in what he was saying, because our marriage had become that, though I did not yet believe the fault for it belonged entirely to me. What struck me most was that he did not once ask what I wanted to do. He assumed, I think, that this conversation was the hard part, that once the confession was made, the healing could begin on his timeline, managed the way he managed a job site, with himself as foreman and me as a problem to be resolved efficiently. I told him I needed to think, the same words I had given my mother, and I watched something like relief cross his face, the relief of a man who believes the worst has already passed. It had not passed. It had barely begun, and the next 2 weeks taught me more about my own family than the previous 35 years combined. Word travels fast in small circles, and ours was smaller than most, because Derek's family and my family had spent 9 years intertwined through contracts and holidays and the particular closeness that develops when one family's livelihood depends quietly on another's goodwill. By the following weekend, it was not a secret anymore. Friends who had been guests at our wedding began sending careful messages, the kind that ask how you're holding up while clearly fishing for details to share elsewhere. And my family, instead of gathering around me the way I had always imagined a family would in a moment like this, began gathering around the problem of what my unhappiness might cost them. My father called me on a Sunday afternoon, and I remember exactly where I was standing, in my own driveway, key still in my hand, sun low enough to throw long shadows across the concrete I had poured myself, ironically enough, 3 summers earlier, back when Derek and I still did projects together on weekends. My father's voice on the phone was gentler than my mother's had been, which somehow made it worse, because gentleness from him has always meant he believes he is being reasonable, and reasonable, in my father's world, has always meant asking me to be smaller than I am. He told me he understood I was hurt. He told me marriages went through seasons. And then, in the same breath, without any apparent awareness of what he was actually saying, he told me that Calder and Sons had just extended his cruise contract through the following spring, and wouldn't it be a shame if things got complicated right when the business was finally stabilizing? I stood in my driveway and I felt something in my chest go very still and very cold, colder than anything Derek's confession had produced in me. My father was not asking me to save my marriage because he believed in my marriage. He was asking me to save my marriage because my marriage was, functionally, his insurance policy, and he was afraid of what would happen to his business if that policy lapsed. I did not raise my voice. I have never once, in my entire life, raised my voice at my father, and I did not start that day. I told him I needed time, and he said, with a note of something that sounded uncomfortably close to pleading, that he hoped I would think about the whole family and not just myself. Think about the whole family and not just myself. I turned that sentence over in my mind for days afterward, because it was, I came to realize, the sentence that had governed my entire life without my ever examining it. I had been the daughter who thought about the whole family. I had been the daughter who chose the marriage that stabilized everyone's finances, who never asked too many questions about how deeply that stability had been built on top of my own choices, who absorbed every family tension quietly because that was simply what I did, the way a load-bearing wall does not get to choose whether it wants to hold up the roof. My brother Scott called 2 days after that, and his version of the conversation was blunter, because Scott has never possessed our father's gift for gentle manipulation. He told me flatly that I was overreacting, that Derek had made a mistake but men made mistakes, that I needed to think about what a divorce would actually mean, not just for me, but for all of us. He mentioned, almost in passing, that he had 2 jobs lined up through Calder and Sons for the fall, and that Frank had told him not to make waves. Not to make waves. As though my life falling apart around me was, to my own brother, primarily an inconvenience that risked disturbing his work schedule. I hung up the phone that day and I sat on the edge of my bed for a long time, longer than I usually allow myself to sit with anything, and I let myself feel, fully, for the first time since the parking lot, exactly how alone I was. Not alone in the sense of having no one physically present, but alone in the deeper sense, the sense of realizing that every person who was supposed to stand between you and the wreckage had instead positioned themselves comfortably behind you, watching to see which way you would fall, calculating what your fall would cost them. That was rock bottom. Not the affair. Not even the 11 months of lies. Rock bottom was the phone call with my father in the driveway, the moment I understood with total, structural clarity that my family had never once, in 35 years, put me first, and that they were not about to start now, not when the stakes were finally high enough to matter. I want to tell you honestly that I cried that night, because I think it matters that you know I am not made of stone, that the calm I carried through those weeks was not the absence of feeling but the deliberate management of it, the same way I manage a structural failure on a job site, by feeling the fear fully and then setting it aside long enough to do the work that actually needs doing. I cried for the marriage I thought I had. I cried for the family I thought would show up. And then, somewhere around midnight, sitting on my bathroom floor with my back against the tub because it was the coolest surface in the house and I needed something solid against my spine, I stopped crying, and something else took its place, something quieter and considerably more dangerous to everyone who had underestimated me. I want to be clear that what happened next was not a decision made in anger, though anger was certainly present. It was a decision made in clarity, the particular clarity that only arrives once you have stopped waiting for other people to rescue you and started asking what you are actually capable of rescuing yourself. I got up off that bathroom floor and I went to my home office, and I opened the external drive I had kept locked away for 6 months, and I looked, really looked, for the first time with the specific intention of using what I had found rather than simply documenting it out of professional caution. I read through every discrepancy between the soil compaction data I had personally collected and the numbers that had been submitted to the state. I cross-referenced dates against Derek's own project management logs, which I still had access to through a shared cloud account nobody had thought to revoke. And I began, that night, to understand not just that something had been falsified, but the shape of who benefited from the falsification and why. I called Patricia Ostrander the next morning and told her I was ready to move forward with the divorce, and I also asked her, carefully, what my professional and legal obligations were regarding evidence of construction fraud that I had discovered in the course of my work but had not yet formally reported. She was quiet for a moment on the phone, and then she asked me, with the particular sharpness of a good lawyer sensing there was more to the story than a routine divorce, whether I wanted to tell her everything. I did. It took 45 minutes, and by the end of it, she was no longer speaking to me the way a divorce attorney speaks to a client. She was speaking to me the way someone speaks to a person who is about to become considerably more dangerous to their own family than anyone in that family currently understood. I did not tell my parents any of this. I did not tell Scott. I certainly did not tell Derek, who was, by that point, calling twice a day with a mixture of guilt and increasing frustration that I was not moving toward the reconciliation he had apparently decided, somewhere in his own mind, was the inevitable outcome of his confession. I let him believe I was still thinking. I let my family believe I was still weighing my options, still capable of being managed the way I had always been managed, through gentle pressure and reminders about the whole family. What none of them knew, what I did not tell a single living soul except my lawyer, was that I had already finalized my independent engineering license 2 weeks earlier, that I had already been in preliminary talks with the state contracting office about inspection work that would put me entirely outside Calder and Son's orbit, and that the file on my external drive, growing heavier every day, was no longer simply a record I was keeping out of professional caution. It had become, in the space of one night on a bathroom floor, a decision waiting for the right moment to be made. There is a specific kind of power that comes from being underestimated by people who love you, and I do not say that bitterly, though I understand if it sounds that way. My family had spent 35 years understanding me as the daughter who absorbed things quietly, who thought about the whole family, who could be counted on to smooth over whatever needed smoothing so that everyone else's lives could continue undisturbed. That version of me had been real. I am not going to pretend she was a performance, because she was not. She was who I actually was for a very long time, shaped by a childhood where love and usefulness had always felt a little too close together to fully separate. But that version of me had also, without my quite noticing it happen, spent 6 years becoming someone else underneath the surface, someone who understood load calculations and stress points and exactly how much weight a structure could bear before the cracks became visible from the outside. The week after that phone call with my father in the driveway, I began quietly moving pieces into place. I met with the state contracting official overseeing the affordable housing project's oversight process, ostensibly to discuss an unrelated inspection contract, and I asked careful, professional questions that revealed nothing about what I actually knew, while learning a great deal about how formal complaints regarding falsified structural documentation were typically handled. I met with a colleague, a fellow engineer named Marcus Reyes who ran a smaller consulting firm on the other side of the county, and I asked him, without explaining why, whether his firm ever took on partners with an existing client book and an independent license. He did not ask me why I was asking. He simply said yes, and told me the door would be open whenever I was ready to walk through it, and there was something in the way he said it, uncomplicated and steady, that I filed away without examining too closely, because I did not yet have room in my life for anything except the work directly in front of me. By the end of that second week, I had stopped absorbing. I had stopped waiting to be asked how I was actually doing before offering my family the version of events that kept them comfortable. When my mother called to ask whether I had reconsidered, I told her plainly that I had filed for divorce, and I listened to the silence on the other end of the line stretch a beat too long before she recovered enough to ask, in a voice gone suddenly careful, what that would mean for the holidays, for the family gatherings, for the delicate web of relationships that had always run through Derek and me like a load-bearing wall nobody wanted to admit they had been leaning on. I did not answer that question, because I did not yet know the answer myself, and because for the first time in longer than I could remember, I understood that I did not owe anyone an answer until I was ready to give one. I hung up the phone that evening and stood at my kitchen window looking out at the same small garden bed Derek had never once helped me weed, and I felt something shift inside my chest, something that was not yet triumph, was not yet peace, but was, unmistakably, the sound of a woman standing up straight after years of quietly bearing weight that was never entirely hers to carry. Rock bottom, I was learning, was not the end of a story. It was simply the moment the ground stopped falling away beneath you, the moment you finally felt solid enough underfoot to decide, on your own terms, exactly what you intended to build next. 3 moves, 3 costs, and I planned every one of them the way I plan a structural retrofit, by identifying exactly where the weight was concentrated and exactly what would happen if I removed the support from underneath it. I did not do this out of cruelty. I want to say that clearly, because it would be easy to hear what came next and assume I had become someone driven by revenge for its own sake. I had not. I was simply, for the first time in my adult life, building instead of absorbing, and it turned out that building, when you have spent years quietly gathering the materials without anyone noticing, moves considerably faster than anyone expects. The first move was the license. I had been sitting on the final paperwork for my independent structural engineering license for nearly 2 years, slow-walked not because the work was difficult but because Derek had always found a reason it was not the right time, a reason that in hindsight was never about timing at all but about control, about keeping me tethered closely enough to his family's business that I never developed the kind of independent standing that might one day make me difficult to manage. I sat at my kitchen table on a Tuesday evening, the same table where he had confessed Bree's name 3 weeks earlier, and I finished the application in under 2 hours, work that should have taken 2 years condensed into the time it takes to eat a quiet dinner alone. I submitted it before midnight. The approval came back 9 days later, and when it did, I felt something settle in my chest that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with the particular satisfaction of finally finishing something that had been unfinished for reasons that were never mine. Derek's father found out about the license before Derek did, because in a town our size, professional licensing announcements travel through the same small channels as everything else, and Randall Calder had built his entire business on knowing things before other people did. He called me directly, which surprised me, because in 9 years of marriage he had rarely called me for anything that was not a holiday or an emergency. He was polite in the way powerful men are polite when they are testing the ground beneath a conversation, asking how I was holding up, mentioning that Derek seemed to be struggling, circling slowly toward the actual purpose of the call, which arrived about 4 minutes in, wrapped in language about family and continuity and how it would be a shame for old working relationships to become complicated by personal matters. I understood, listening to him, that Randall Calder had spent 9 years assuming I would remain easy to manage precisely because I had always been the wife who worked quietly in the background, useful but never independent enough to walk away without consequence. The license cost him that assumption. I heard it land in the small pause before he ended the call, the pause of a man recalculating. The second move took longer, and it mattered more, because it was the move that actually put ground between me and Calder and Sons rather than simply proving I could stand on my own. The State Affordable Housing Office had an open request for an independent oversight engineer, someone to review inspection compliance on future publicly funded projects across the county, work that would place me directly across the table from companies like Calder and Sons rather than working alongside them. I applied using my new license, my 9 years of inspection history, and a portfolio of work that spoke for itself without needing anyone's family name attached to it. The interview process took 3 weeks. I did not tell anyone I was in it, not my parents, not Scott, not even Marcus, who I had begun speaking with more regularly under the professional pretense of exploring a partnership, conversations that had started out purely practical and had begun, in ways I was not yet ready to examine closely, to become something I looked forward to more than the work itself justified. I got the contract on a Thursday afternoon, a call from a woman named Elaine Foster at the state office, congratulating me on being selected, and I sat in my car in the same parking lot where I had first read Derek's messages 3 months earlier, and I let myself feel, fully and without apology, the particular joy of having built something entirely my own. It was not lost on me, the symmetry of that parking lot, the way it had become the site of both my worst moment and one of my best, as though the universe wanted me to understand that the same ground could hold both kinds of truth. The contract meant Calder and Sons had just lost their oldest and most reliable outside inspection relationship, replaced by an oversight structure that would now scrutinize their work with an independence they had never had to answer to before. It cost them a project they had assumed was locked in, and it cost Randall Calder something considerably more valuable than money. It cost him certainty. The third move was quieter, and I almost did not make it, because it required trusting Marcus with more of the truth than I had trusted anyone with since the night on my bathroom floor. I told him, over coffee that had started as a business conversation and stretched into something neither of us rushed to end, about the discrepancies I had found in the housing project's structural reports, though I did not yet tell him everything, did not yet tell him about Bree or her father, because that piece of the puzzle had not fully assembled itself for me yet either. I told him I was thinking about buying into a partnership stake in a smaller firm, one with an established client base but limited engineering capacity, a firm that could use exactly the kind of specialized structural expertise I had spent 9 years developing. Marcus listened the way he always listened, without rushing to solve anything, without performing concern the way Derek had always performed concern, as though attention itself were something to be managed rather than simply given. When I finished, he told me his firm was exactly that kind of firm, and that he had, in fact, been hoping I would eventually ask. We finalized the partnership stake within 2 weeks, a smaller investment than the license or the contract in terms of visible drama, but the one that mattered most in terms of what it took away from Derek specifically. For 9 years, my professional identity had existed partly in relation to his family's company, contracts that flowed because of the marriage, credibility that had been built, in ways I had not fully acknowledged even to myself, on the assumption that I was Derek Calder's wife first and an engineer second. The partnership stake severed that assumption completely. I was no longer someone who worked adjacent to Calder and Sons. I was, as of that Tuesday morning when the paperwork finalized, a partner in a competing firm, with my own client relationships, my own state contract, and my own name on the door. Derek found out through a mutual acquaintance rather than from me, and when he called that evening, his voice carried a note I had never heard from him before, something close to genuine alarm, as though he were only now beginning to understand that the woman he had spent months assuming would eventually come around had already built an entire life he had no access to and no leverage over. The fourth move was the smallest and the hardest, and it was the one that cost my own family rather than Derek's, though I did not make it to punish them. My mother called to inform me, not ask, inform me, that there would be a family dinner the following Sunday, an attempt, thinly disguised as an ordinary gathering, to bring Derek and me into the same room under the pretense of a normal family occasion, the kind of engineered reconciliation my mother had clearly been planning since the driveway phone call weeks earlier. I could hear, underneath her careful casualness, the same panic that had been present in every conversation since this began, the panic of a woman trying to reassemble a structure that had already been condemned. I told her, calmly and without anger, that I would not be attending. She was quiet for a long moment, and then she asked, in a voice that had gone thin, whether I understood what I was doing to this family. I told her I understood exactly what I was doing, and that for the first time in a long while, I was doing it for myself rather than for anyone else's comfort. That declined dinner cost my parents something I think mattered more to them than any of the professional losses had cost Derek's family, because it cost them the illusion that guilt still worked on me, that if they simply applied enough pressure in the familiar shape of family obligation, I would eventually fold the way I always had before. I did not fold. I spent that Sunday evening instead having dinner with Marcus, an evening that had started, again, as something adjacent to business, a conversation about a joint inspection project we were coordinating, and had turned, somewhere around the second glass of wine, into something neither of us labeled out loud but both of us understood was no longer entirely professional. I want to tell you about that dinner carefully, because I think it matters, not as a rebound, not as a reward for surviving betrayal, but as the first evidence in months that I was still capable of being seen by someone without having to manage what they saw. Marcus asked me, at one point, how the housing project data was coming along, whether I had found anything more since we last spoke, and I told him, hesitantly at first, about the pattern I was beginning to see, the way the falsified numbers seemed to cluster around specific dates, specific approval signatures. He did not tell me to be careful, did not tell me it wasn't my problem, did not perform concern the way people had been performing concern at me for weeks. He asked good questions. He asked whether I had cross-referenced the dates against the state contracting calendar, a question so precisely useful that I sat back in my chair and looked at him for a long moment before answering, because it was, I realized, the first time in longer than I could remember that someone had responded to my competence by engaging with it rather than by either dismissing it or being intimidated by it. I did not kiss him that night. I want to be honest about the pace of things, because I think honesty matters more than drama here. What happened instead was smaller and, in its own way, more significant. He walked me to my car in the parking lot outside the restaurant, and instead of the awkward hovering that usually accompanies the end of a dinner neither party is sure how to categorize, he simply said that he had enjoyed the evening, that he hoped I knew he was not going anywhere, professionally or otherwise, and that I should take whatever time I needed to figure out what I wanted, because he had no interest in being anyone's rebound and even less interest in rushing someone who was still in the middle of dismantling a life that had not treated her fairly. I drove home that night with the windows cracked, cool air moving through the car, and I felt something I had not let myself feel in months, something that was not yet hope exactly, but was, unmistakably, the early architecture of it. The weeks that followed brought a strange kind of quiet, the quiet that settles over a job site after a controlled demolition, dust still hanging in the air, but the structure that needed to come down finally down. My parents stopped calling as frequently, not out of respect, I understood, but out of a kind of bewildered recalculation, as though they were still trying to determine what leverage remained now that guilt and financial panic had both failed to move me. Scott sent one more message, terse and clearly written under our father's direction, suggesting I was being selfish, and I did not respond to it at all, which turned out to be its own kind of answer. Derek, for his part, began calling less about reconciliation and more about logistics, the house, the finances, the slow mechanical unwinding of a shared life, and I noticed, with something like clinical detachment, that his voice had lost the confidence it once carried, replaced by the uncertain tone of a man who had assumed the ground beneath him would always hold and was only now understanding that some structures, once compromised, do not simply repair themselves because you want them to. I kept working. I kept building the file, quietly, methodically, cross-referencing every new piece of data against what I already had, watching a pattern emerge that was bigger and more damaging than I had initially understood, though I did not yet know how much bigger, did not yet know about Bree's father or the contracting bid or the full shape of what Derek's affair had actually been leveraging. I kept having dinner with Marcus, slowly, unhurriedly, two people who had both learned, in different ways, the value of not rushing towards something simply because it felt good in the moment. And underneath all of it, I kept feeling that same quiet, steady sensation I had first felt in the parking lot after signing the state contract, the sensation of a woman who had spent years being told what her life was supposed to look like, finally understanding that she had been capable, the entire time, of drawing the blueprint herself. I want to tell you about the moment it clicked into place, because it did not arrive gradually. It arrived all at once, on a Wednesday morning, while I was cross-referencing the state contracting calendar Marcus had suggested I check weeks earlier, the same calendar that listed which officials had reviewed and approved which bids on which dates. I was looking for a pattern in the falsified structural reports, trying to understand whether the alterations had been made by a single person or approved through a chain, and what I found instead was a name I recognized immediately, because it was a name I had read 11 months' worth of messages about. Ashford. The state contracting official who had final approval authority over the affordable housing bid was a man named Gerald Ashford, and Gerald Ashford, it took me exactly 4 minutes of searching to confirm, was Bree's father. I sat very still at my desk for a long time after that, the way I imagine a person sits still after finally understanding the full shape of a structural failure they had only been examining one crack at a time. Derek's affair had never been simply about feeling unseen in his marriage, the explanation he had offered me across our kitchen table weeks earlier, an explanation I had allowed myself to half believe because it was, in its own limited way, honest about the loneliness even if it was not honest about the rest. The affair had also been leverage. Calder and Sons had been trying to win the affordable housing contract at a price low enough to maximize their margins, a bid that required exactly the kind of favorable interpretation an official like Gerald Ashford could provide if he were inclined to look generously on the numbers. I do not know, even now, whether Derek pursued Bree with that calculation already in mind, or whether the calculation revealed itself to him gradually, the way convenient realizations often do to people who have never had to examine their own motives too closely. It did not matter anymore which version was true. What mattered was that my husband's betrayal and my company's fraud were not two separate wounds. They were the same wound, inflicted by the same hand, for reasons that had never once considered what it would cost me. There was a second piece, and this one hurt in a way I had not expected, because it came from inside my own family rather than from Derek's. Cross-referencing the subcontractor records on the housing project, records I had access to through my new state oversight role, I found my brother Scott's name attached to the electrical work on two of the buildings where the structural discrepancies were most severe. I called him that evening, and I did not lead with accusation, because I have never once, in my whole life, led with accusation with Scott, even when accusation was exactly what the moment called for. I asked him, plainly, whether he had seen anything unusual on that job site, anything about the foundation work that had struck him as rushed or off. There was a long silence on the line before he answered, and in that silence I heard everything I needed to know before he ever said a word. He told me, eventually, in a voice that had lost all of its earlier bluntness, that he had noticed things, cracks in curing concrete that seemed to appear too fast, inspection sign-offs that came through faster than felt right for a project that size. He told me he had mentioned it to our father, once, early on, and that Frank had told him not to ask questions that might cost the family its contracts, that Calder and Sons paid on time and paid well, and that a man in Scott's position could not afford to be the reason that relationships soured. I sat with the phone against my ear and I felt something in my chest that was not quite anger and not quite grief, something closer to a kind of exhausted recognition, the recognition of a pattern I had somehow always known existed in my family but had never before seen laid out so plainly. My father had asked my brother to look away from a safety issue that could have hurt real families, real children living in those apartments, because the alternative risked disturbing a financial relationship he depended on. It was, I understood in that moment, the exact same instinct that had shaped every phone call I had received since my marriage collapsed, the instinct to protect the structure of dependency at any cost, even when the cost was measured in other people's safety, or in my own dignity. I did not yell at Scott. I told him, calmly, that I needed him to understand the seriousness of what he was describing, and that I intended to bring the full documentation forward, formally, to the state board, and that his name would likely come up in that process regardless of what either of us wanted. I gave him the chance to get ahead of it, to come forward himself rather than be dragged forward by my report, and I could hear, in the silence that followed, a man weighing loyalty to our father against the growing understanding that silence was no longer a neutral choice, if it had ever been one at all. The confrontation climax came 9 days later, at the public unveiling ceremony for the completed affordable housing project, an event Calder and Sons had planned as a celebration, ribbon cutting, local news coverage, Randall Calder in a pressed suit shaking hands with the mayor's office representative and, unknowingly, standing not 15 feet from Gerald Ashford, the man whose daughter had helped secure the very bid being celebrated. I had requested to attend in my official capacity as the newly appointed independent oversight engineer for the county, a request that Calder and Sons, still not fully understanding what my new role actually meant, had approved without hesitation, assuming my presence would simply lend official credibility to their event. I stood at the back of the crowd for most of the ceremony, watching Derek stand near his father, watching him scan the crowd once, briefly, and find me, watching something uncertain cross his face before he turned his attention back to the podium. I had brought a folder with me, thin, unremarkable looking, the kind of folder nobody at a ribbon-cutting ceremony would think twice about. Inside it was 6 months of comparative data, the original soil compaction and structural inspection numbers I had personally collected, laid side by side with the falsified figures that had been submitted to the state, along with a summary memo addressed to the County Oversight Board and, as a courtesy, a copy for the local reporter I had noticed setting up near the podium, a young woman named Priya Chandra who covered local development stories for the regional paper and had, in an earlier phone call I made 2 days before the ceremony, expressed considerable interest in what I had described only as a potential story about construction oversight in publicly funded housing. I did not wait for the ceremony to end. I want to tell you honestly that I considered doing this quietly through proper channels the following Monday rather than in front of a crowd, and I decided against it, not out of a desire for spectacle, but because I understood that quiet channels had already failed the people this project was supposed to house, failed them the moment someone decided falsified paperwork was an acceptable price for a faster approval. I walked up toward the podium area during the reception that followed the speeches, found Priya Chandra near the refreshment table, and handed her the folder, along with a brief, calm explanation of what she was looking at and an offer to answer any questions she had, on the record, whenever she was ready. She did not wait long. Within 20 minutes, she had approached Randall Calder directly, in front of several other guests, asking him to comment on discrepancies between submitted inspection reports and independently collected structural data for the very project being celebrated that afternoon. I watched his face from across the room, watched the practiced ease he had carried through the entire ceremony drain away in real time, replaced by the particular panic of a man realizing, in public, that a problem he believed was contained had never actually been contained at all. Derek found me a few minutes later, pulling me aside near the edge of the parking lot, his voice low and urgent in a way I had not heard from him since the earliest days of our marriage, though the urgency now had nothing to do with wanting me and everything to do with fear. He asked me how I could do this, today of all days, in front of everyone, and I looked at him, really looked at him, and I told him the truth as plainly as I have ever told anyone anything. I told him I had spent 9 years absorbing whatever needed absorbing so that the people around me could remain comfortable, and that I was done, that families were going to live in those buildings believing the ground beneath them had been properly inspected, and that his company's convenience had never once outweighed their safety, no matter how inconvenient the timing of the truth turned out to be for him. I told him about Gerald Ashford, watched his face go pale as he understood, in that moment, that I knew exactly what his affair had actually been in service of. I did not raise my voice. I have never once needed to raise my voice to say something that was simply, undeniably true, and I understood, watching him standing there in the parking lot with nowhere left to hide, that the loudest thing in that entire conversation was the silence he had no answer for. The story that followed the ceremony moved faster than any of us expected, faster, I think, than even Randall Calder had time to manage with charm. The County Oversight Board opened a formal investigation within a week, and Priya Chandra's article ran 2 days after that, thorough and carefully sourced, laying out the discrepancies between the submitted paperwork and the original data in language that left no room for the kind of ambiguity a company like Calder and Sons had always relied on to smooth over its problems. Gerald Ashford resigned from his position at the contracting office before the investigation had even concluded, a resignation that read, to anyone paying attention, as a confession dressed up in bureaucratic language. Bree left town not long after, and I never learned exactly where she went, and I found, somewhat to my own surprise, that I did not particularly want to know. She had been a piece of something larger than herself, used in ways I suspect she only partially understood, and I could not find it in myself to spend any more of my energy on her than the situation had already demanded. Calder and Sons lost the housing contract formally within a month, and lost 2 other pending bids shortly after, as word spread through the same small professional circles that had once made my marriage feel like the center of a comfortable web. Randall Calder stepped back from day-to-day operations not long after that, citing health reasons that everyone understood to be at least partly reputational, and Derek, who had spent 9 years assuming his last name would always be enough to smooth over whatever needed smoothing, found himself, for the first time in his adult life, having to build a professional reputation on merit alone, a task he was, by all later accounts, finding considerably harder than he had ever imagined. My father's reckoning came more slowly, and more quietly, and in its own way it was the reckoning that mattered most to me, because it was the one that had actually shaped my life from the inside rather than simply intersecting with it. Once Calder and Sons stopped being a reliable source of subcontracts, my father's business went through a rough stretch, several months of scrambling for work in a much smaller and more competitive pool than he had grown used to relying on. He called me during that stretch, not to ask me to fix his marriage this time, because there was no marriage left to fix, but simply to talk, and I want to tell you honestly that the first few of those calls were still colored by an old, familiar undertone, a hope, unspoken but present, that I might offer him something, a contract, a connection, a way back into stability through me the way I had always been the way back into stability for him before. I did not offer that, not at first, and I want to explain why, because I think it matters. I was not punishing him. I had already moved past the part of this story where punishment felt like the point. But I understood, with a clarity I had earned the hard way, that if I offered my father help too quickly, before either of us had actually sat with what had happened, I would simply be rebuilding the same structure that had nearly buried me, a structure where my usefulness was the thing that made me valuable to my own family. I wanted, if there was going to be a relationship with my father going forward, for it to be built on something sturdier than that. The conversation that actually changed things happened on a Sunday afternoon in early autumn, almost 6 months after that first phone call in my driveway. My father drove out to see me, unannounced, which was unlike him, and he sat across from me at my kitchen table, the same table, and told me, in a voice I had genuinely never heard him use before, that he was sorry. Not sorry in the vague, deflecting way he had apologized for things in the past, sorry that I felt that way, sorry if he had upset me, but a specific, plain sorry, for the phone call in the driveway, for asking me to think about the whole family instead of asking how I was, for spending 35 years teaching me that my worth was tied to what I could hold up for other people. He told me he had spent the last few months without the safety net Calder and Sons had provided, and that the fear of that instability had, for the first time, forced him to actually look at how much of his own peace of mind had been built on top of choices that were never his to make, choices that had always quietly belonged to me. I cried at that table, the first time I had let myself cry in front of my father since I was a very young girl, and it was not sadness exactly, or not only sadness. It was the particular release of finally being seen by someone who had spent your whole life looking past you toward what you could provide. I told him I forgave him, and I meant it, though I also told him, plainly, that forgiveness did not mean forgetting, that I intended to be far more careful, from that point forward, about which parts of myself I made available to people, including him. He nodded, and he did not argue, and something in that nod told me he finally understood. I did offer him a subcontract eventually, several weeks later, through my own firm, work that had nothing to do with Calder and Sons and everything to do with a genuine need my firm had for reliable landscaping partners on several municipal projects. I offered it because the work was legitimate and he was good at it, not because I owed him rescue, and I made sure, before I offered it, that he understood the difference. He took the work, and he has done it well, and our relationship since then has been smaller than it once was, in the sense that I no longer let it carry the weight it used to carry, but steadier, and considerably more honest, which is, I have come to believe, worth far more than the version we had before. Scott's reckoning was harder, because unlike my father, he did come forward eventually, testified to the oversight board about what he had witnessed and what he had been told to ignore, and it cost him some work in the short term, contractors in our area being understandably cautious about hiring someone who had been willing, even under pressure, to look away from a safety concern. I do not know if we will ever be as close as siblings are supposed to be. Some structures, once compromised, do not fully return to their original strength no matter how carefully you reinforce them. But he is trying, in his own limited way, and I have found that I am willing to meet limited effort with limited but genuine warmth, which feels, at this point in my life, like exactly the right amount. And then there is Marcus, and I want to tell you about him carefully, because I do not want you to think this is simply a story about a woman who traded one relationship for another, a rescue disguised as romance. It was never that. What grew between Marcus and me grew slowly, over months of joint projects and careful conversations and dinners that took their time getting anywhere, and by the time I understood what it actually was, it had already become something sturdier than anything I had built with Derek in 9 years of marriage. He proposed to me on a job site, of all places, not the housing project, a different one, a community center we had both worked on inspecting together, standing on the finished foundation slab in the late afternoon light, and he did not get down on one knee with a rehearsed speech. He simply told me that he had never once, in all the months we had worked together, doubted that I could carry whatever weight was placed in front of me, and that he wanted to spend the rest of his life being the kind of partner who noticed that strength instead of quietly depending on it without ever naming it. I said yes, standing on a concrete slab we had both personally verified was structurally sound, which felt, to both of us, exactly right. We were married the following spring, in a small ceremony with no string lights hung by anyone who did not trust me to get the details right myself, because I hung them, and I got the spacing exactly the way I wanted it. My father walked me down the aisle, and it was the first entirely uncomplicated moment we had shared in years, and I let myself simply enjoy it without waiting for the undertone I had spent so long learning to listen for. I think about that Tuesday afternoon in the parking lot sometimes, the delivery slip printing, the phone lighting up on the passenger seat, and I no longer think of it as the worst day of my life, though for a long time I did. I think of it now as the day the crack finally became visible, which meant it was finally a crack I was allowed to do something about, instead of one I had been quietly reinforcing from the inside for years without anyone else even knowing it was there. If you were somewhere in the middle of your own version of that day, still absorbing weight that was never yours to carry alone, still waiting for the people around you to prove they see you as more than what you provide, I want you to know that the ground does eventually hold, once you stop waiting for permission to build on your own terms.